There's something uncomfortable about the way we talk about NBA legacies, right? We spend years watching a player, years, hundreds of regular season games, dozens of playoff series, thousands upon thousands of possessions. And then sometimes we decide how great the player was because of one play, one shot, one injury, one bad possession, 1 inch. Think about Kevin Durant. If his shoe was slightly smaller against Milwaukee in 2021, are we talking about him completely differently today? Think about Chris Paul. If his hamstring holds up for maybe another week in 2018, does he go from being the point guard who could never win the big one to an NBA champion who helped end the Warriors dynasty? Think about James Harden. What if just a few of those 27 consecutive missed threes ended up falling? And what about Allen Iverson? What if Philly somehow finishes what they started when they shocked the Lakers in Game 1 of the 2001 NBA Finals? That is what we're talking about today. Not necessarily the greatest players who never won. We're talking about the players whose entire historical reputation was sitting on the other side of just one moment. Because when you really examine NBA history, sometimes the difference between being called a champion and being called a failure is much smaller than we'd like to admit. And so with that being said, let's get the intro out the way. And so let's start with probably the most literal example, right? Kevin Durant, 2021, Brooklyn Nets versus Milwaukee Bucks. Game 7, baby. And before we even get to the shot, you've got to understand what was happening around Kevin Durant during this time. Brooklyn had assembled one of the most talented offensive trios the league had ever seen. Kevin Durant, James Harden, Kyrie Irving. I mean, on paper, this was absolutely ridiculous. But as we all know, by the time the Milwaukee series came around, everything, and I mean everything, was falling apart. Kyrie injured his ankle, Harden injured his hamstring and eventually returned, but clearly was not himself. So suddenly, Kevin Durant had to carry an enormous offensive burden, and that he did. Durant had nearly dropped 49 points, 17 rebounds, and 10 assists in Game 5. And then Game 7 happens, and KD plays 53 minutes, and he scores 48 points. Brooklyn is down to 2 late in regulation. Durant catches the ball, he turns, shoots over PJ Tucker, and then boom, bucket. Is right on the money. Barkley Center explodes. For a second, it looked like Kevin Durant just sent Milwaukee home. Except when you rewind just a little bit, you notice something. Kevin Durant's foot was on the 3-point line. Barely. I mean, I'm talking about a big toe on the 3-point line. It ended up being a 2-point shot and tie game. And then we go into overtime and Brooklyn eventually loses. Milwaukee advances and the Bucks eventually win the NBA championship. Now here's the legacy question. What happens if Kevin Durant's foot is behind that line? Because there's a realistic possibility that Brooklyn wins the championship, right? It doesn't guarantee anything. Atlanta was waiting in the Eastern Conference Finals, and Phoenix eventually came out the West. But Milwaukee was arguably Brooklyn's biggest obstacle, and suddenly Kevin Durant potentially has another championship with Stephen Curry. And that would be enormous for his legacy. Because what's one of the biggest criticisms people use against Kevin Durant? Oh, you had to join Golden State. You had to join Steph Curry. You joined a 73-win team. But imagine Durant leading an injured Brooklyn team to an NBA championship. I mean, that entire conversation changes. Instead of people constantly debating whether Durant proved he could lead his own team, he would have literally done it. And Milwaukee's history changes also. Giannis might not have won a championship. That legendary 50-point closeout game against Phoenix, that never happens. The block on DeAndre Ayton, that never happens. The alley-oop to Giannis, that never happens. Maybe people spend the next few years asking whether Giannis can win in Milwaukee. All because Kevin Durant's shoe was touching a line. That's how thin the margin can be. And so moving on to the next example, right? Because now we have Chris Paul and them old man hamstrings. The 2018 Houston Rockets. Because people sometimes forget just how good this team was. Houston won 65 games. As a reminder, right? James Harden won MVP. Chris Paul gave Houston exactly what it needed. Another elite ball handler who could punish defenses whenever Harden sat or got trapped. But there was one giant problem, as we all know. The Golden State Warriors existed. And not just regular Golden State. We're not talking about 73-win Golden State. We're talking about Golden State with Kevin Durant, with Stephen Curry, with Klay Thompson, with Draymond Green. This was arguably the most talented team ever assembled anywhere on Earth, in Mars, on Pluto, anywhere. And Houston basically built its entire roster with one purpose. We don't care about beating Cleveland. We don't care about beating the Clippers, the OKC, the Nuggets. We built this team to beat Golden State. Switch everything defensively. Shoot a ridiculous number of threes. Isolate Harden and Paul against favorable matchups. Take away Golden State's movement. And unbelievably, to everyone's surprise, this worked like a charm. Over the years of Golden State, who has come closer to beating them besides this Houston team? And after 5 games, Houston leads Golden State 3-2. They are one win away from eliminating the Kevin Durant Warriors. Then Chris Paul hurts his hamstring late in Game 5. And just like that, folks, it's a wrap. He's done. Houston loses Game 6, then comes Game 7. And everybody remembers what happened because we were all going crazy. 27 consecutive missed threes. Listen to how crazy. 27 consecutive missed threes. At what point do you try something else? And even crazier, Houston still led by 11 at halftime. And then Golden State exploded, the Warriors won, Houston went home. But imagine Chris Paul doesn't get injured. Houston has 2 opportunities to win 1 game. And if Houston beats Golden State, they're facing LeBron James and Cleveland in the finals. And that Cavaliers team was nowhere near the 2016 championship roster. Kyrie Irving was gone. LeBron was carrying an enormous burden, right? Houston would likely enter that series as the favorite. And so imagine this alternative history. Chris Paul stays healthy. Houston eliminates one of the greatest teams ever. Houston beats Cleveland. James Harden becomes a champion during his MVP season. Chris Paul becomes a champion. Mike D'Antoni becomes a championship coach. And suddenly, 2 careers that have spent years being criticized for playoff failures look a lot different. Think about Harden specifically, right? Today, when people debate Harden's historical ranking, the postseason always comes up. The bad elimination games, the turnovers, the shooting struggles. But if Harden has a championship in 2018, especially if he beats Durant, Curry, Klay, and Draymond to get there, that's one of the most impressive championships of the modern era. The exact same player suddenly gets remembered way differently. That's why Chris Paul injury wasn't simply an injury. It potentially changed how an entire generation remembers James Harden. And we can't talk about Houston without separating Chris Paul's injury from what actually happened in Game 7, because Houston still had an opportunity. And this is where basketball becomes very cruel. 27 straight missed threes. Think about how insane that is. Houston didn't need to suddenly shoot 50%. They didn't need Harden to become Michael Jordan. They just needed a few shots. Imagine 3 of those misses going in. That's 9 points. Game 7 was decided by 9 points. And obviously, basketball doesn't work perfectly like that. The Warriors would have responded differently, but that's the point. The margin was incredibly small, and this is where Harden's legacy becomes fascinating. Because when people look back, they see Harden lost again. But when you're actually living through that game, Houston had Golden State in legitimate danger. That's why legacy conversations can become too simplistic. Winning and losing matters, yes. But sometimes we treat the final result as though it tells us everything about how well somebody played or how close they actually were. Harden was closer to beating arguably the greatest roster ever than history sometimes make it sound. And so bring it back to 01, because we have Allen Iverson, man. Philadelphia 76ers, one of the most iconic individual seasons in NBA history. Iverson wins MVP, Philly reaches the NBA Finals, but waiting for them, as we all know, one big old Shaquille O'Neal and one Kobe Bryant and the Los Angeles Lakers. And these were not just the defending champions. The Lakers entered the finals 11-0 in the playoffs. They had not lost a game. Then Allen Iverson, with the braids, walks into Los Angeles. Game 1, gives them 48 points. Straight off the top, 48 points. The game goes to overtime. Iverson hits that famous jumper over on Tyronn Lue, steps over him, Philly wins. And suddenly, the unbeatable Lakers are 11-1. Now, ultimately, Philly loses the next 4 games, as we all know. So I'm not going to pretend they were one possession away from winning the championship, because they were not. They were not even close. But that series shows another side of legacy. Sometimes one moment can actually save a legacy, because nobody remembers Iverson's 0-1 finals as some embarrassing defeat, right? People remember the step over. They remember the 48. They remember that he handed the Lakers team its only postseason loss. Iverson lost the championship, yet somehow became even more legendary. That's important, because legacy isn't purely championships, right? It's also about how you perform when the odds are completely against you. Iverson's Game 1 became evidence people use for him instead of against him. That's how powerful one performance can end up being for you. Now we get to Charles Barkley. Now I'm bringing it even more back, because we in 1993. And this one hurts when you really examine it. Barkley gets traded to Phoenix. Immediately, he wins MVP. Phoenix wins 62 games. They reach the NBA Finals. And standing across from Barkley is one Michael Jordan. God damn, he just seems to be everywhere in the 90s. Chicago wins the series 4-2. And because Barkley never returned to the finals, that's basically where his championship story ends. But Game 6 shows just how close things can get, because Phoenix is at home. Chicago leads the series 3-2. The Suns are trying to force a Game 7. Phoenix leads 98-96 late into the game. Chicago gets the ball, Jordan attacks, the ball eventually gets to John Paxson, wide open 3, bang. Chicago leads 99-98. Phoenix gets one final opportunity. Kevin Johnson attacks, Horace Grant blocks the attempt, series over. Chicago champions. Now, imagine Paxson misses. Phoenix wins Game 7. We get to Game 7 in Phoenix. Does Barkley beat Jordan? We don't know. Chicago might win. The Suns might win. But Barkley would have had an opportunity to win a championship on his home floor against Michael Jordan. And if he does, Charles Barkley's legacy becomes almost untouchable. Champion. Beat Jordan in the finals. Suddenly, whenever people discuss the greatest power forwards ever, Barkley has a championship sitting on his resume. Instead, he becomes one of the faces of the greatest players without a ring conversation. And that's a massive historical difference. And it came down to Phoenix failing to close just one game. And then that brings me to a larger point. We need to be careful with championship culture. I'm not saying rings don't matter. Of course they matter. Basketball is competition, and the goal is to win. The greatest players should be judged partly by how they perform in the biggest moments. But championships aren't individual statistics. They're team outcomes. And team outcomes are affected by everything. I mean health, teammates, coaching, matchups, front offices, opponent quality, and even just straight up luck. Kevin Durant's toe didn't suddenly make him a worse basketball player. Chris Paul's hamstring didn't make Harden less skilled. John Paxson making a 3 did not erase Charles Barkley's MVP season. But those moments dramatically influence how history remembers them. That's the contradiction. We say basketball is a team sport, then we use team champions as one of our biggest individual measurements. But there is another side to this, because here's where this conversation gets even more interesting. If we're going to give players credit for almost winning, we have to acknowledge that some legendary winners were incredibly close to losing. Think about Ray Allen in 2013. Miami is seconds away from losing a championship. Fans are already preparing for San Antonio to celebrate. LeBron misses a 3. Chris Bosh gets the rebound, Allen backpedals, corner, bang, Miami survives. Eventually, they go on to win Game 7. Now think about how differently LeBron's Miami tenure gets discussed if Ray Allen misses. Miami would have gone 1-2 in the finals through LeBron's first 3 seasons there. Remember, not 5, not 6, not 7. That would have looked even worse. But instead, Miami repeats. LeBron wins final MVP again. 1 rebound, 1 pass, 1 shot. There we go. There we have it. History changes. That's why this argument has to work both ways. If we're going to criticize players because they didn't win, we need to acknowledge how close some winners came to not winning. Then we have Kawhi's bounce. 2019, Toronto, Philly, Game 7. Kawhi Leonard shoots over Joel Embiid. The ball hits the rim. It bounces, bounces again, bounces some more, one more time for good luck, and then it falls. Toronto advances. Eventually, the Raptors win the championship. Kawhi becomes a 2 times Finals MVP. He becomes the man who delivered Canada its first NBA championship. That playoff run becomes the defining stretch of his career. But imagine that ball does not fall. Maybe Philly wins in overtime. Maybe Toronto loses. And suddenly, Kawhi's 1 season in Toronto ends without a championship. Now, still a great season, but nowhere near the mythology it has today. And that's literally a basketball bouncing differently on a rim. So how should we judge players? Championships should matter, but context should also matter. Instead of asking, how many rings does he have? Your question should be, how good was he when his team had a legitimate opportunity to win? What did the offense do to stop him? What teammates did he have? Who was he playing against? Did he elevate his team? Did he perform? Did injuries change the outcome? There's a much more complicated conversation, but it's also a much more accurate one. Because if Kevin Durant's foot being 1 inch backward changes your entire opinion of Kevin Durant, maybe your evaluation was too dependent on the result in the first place. If Chris Paul's hamstring determines whether James Harden is a winner, maybe Harden's ability deserves to be evaluated independently from that injury. And if John Paxson determines whether Charles Barkley gets called a champion, maybe basketball history is much more fragile than we pretend. And so NBA history looks inevitable when we look backward. Jordan won 6, LeBron won his championships, Curry built his dynasty, Giannis conquered Milwaukee, Kawhi delivered Toronto a title, and everybody else either won or lost. But when those games were actually happening, nothing was inevitable. Kevin Durant was inches away. Chris Paul was 1 healthy hamstring away. Charles Barkley was 1 game away. James Harden was 1 or 2 made threes away. And that's why I think we need to change how we talk about NBA legacies. Because sometimes the difference between a player being called a champion and being called someone who couldn't get it done isn't talent, it's not mentality, it's not heart. Sometimes it's just 1 possession, just 1 bounce, 1 injury, 1 play. And that's what makes NBA history so fascinating. Because somewhere in an alternate version of basketball history, Chris Paul has a ring. Harden conquered Golden State. Durant's shot was a 3. And Barkley probably beat Jordan. And we're having completely different GOAT conversations today. And so if you like this kind of video, like, subscribe, because we just passed 300 subscribers and we on the road to 500.